Ma nii palju ütlen, et kui teile trükitud kavades on Sami Nevala alles järgmine kõneleja, siis Rosa ja Sami vahetasid kohad ära, et kõik on korras, mõlemad ettekanded tulevad.
Good morning. Yes, my name is Sami Nevala. I'm the head of sector for statistics and surveys at the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. This is one of the about 30 or so EU agencies which are spread over all the EU member states. In Estonia there is the Agency for Large-Scale Information Systems, and the Fundamental Rights Agency is based in Vienna, Austria. And we have worked there since 2007 on a very broad mandate to look at the realization of fundamental rights. So how do the different fundamental rights norms and legislation, how do they come into practice in people's everyday lives? And one of the ways that our agency is working in this area is collecting first-hand data. Because on many fundamental rights questions, when we need to find comparable and reliable data for all the 28 EU member states, we've had to conclude that the data is simply not there. We have to collect it. And when we received the request from the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union in 2009-2010 to collect comparable and reliable data on violence against women, we set out to design a survey that would ask and interview random samples of women in each EU member state about their experiences. We designed this survey to fill this data gap that was highlighted by the European Parliament and the Council of the EU, that is the member states, but also looking into the different needs and calls for this type of data that had been presented. These have come over the years from the UN level. There's a number of conclusions by different UN treaty bodies highlighting the fact that there's an absence of data on violence against women. There have been indicators developed both by the EU, but also by, for example, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to have comparable information on violence against women. And most recently, as we've already mentioned, there has been the Convention of the Council of Europe, the Istanbul Convention, which for those countries that ratify the Convention, presents some common standards which have not been in place so far, as the Istanbul Convention is the first legally binding instrument for Europe. And this also creates the need to then monitor the implementation of the Convention. The Convention has just entered into force earlier this year in August, and the big challenge now for the coming years is to have more countries ratify it, but also then to ensure that the countries have implemented the provisions of the Convention. And that is something where the survey that our Fundamental Rights Agency has carried out can contribute to by providing comparable data on many of the forms of violence that are addressed in the Istanbul Convention. So just to briefly explain you how the survey was carried out, as I already mentioned, we collected a random sample of women in each EU member state, which means that the results of the survey are representative of women's experiences both at the member state level and at the EU level. We interviewed only one woman per household in order to ensure that the information that is shared by the respondents stays confidential and is treated anonymously. The interviews were carried out face-to-face, and they were quite extensive, depending also on the experiences that women had. And I will show you in a minute exactly what this survey covered. This was a very complex process, and developing the survey from the beginning to end takes a lot of time. I'm not going to explain you in detail this process, but if you are interested, we have on the website of the FRA a very detailed technical documentation available, and at the end of my presentation I will also give you an overview of all the materials that we have produced based on the survey and that are available for further use. So just to conclude, before I move on to the results, our survey covered all the 28 EU member states. We interviewed approximately 1,500 women in each country, which means in total we interviewed some 42,000 women in the EU. The survey collected information about women's experiences of physical and sexual violence, both by partners and non-partners. Non-partners means other persons than partners. So, for example, it could be colleagues at the workplace, strangers in the street, or other family members and relatives. The survey also asked women about their experiences of psychological violence in a partnership. And what's very important for the survey is, as it was in the EU context, was also to address sexual harassment. Because sexual harassment is one of the few areas of violence against women where there is binding EU legislation concerning sexual harassment in the workplace. Another challenge for the survey was, and this is because we designed the survey to, as well as possible, to fit together with the Istanbul Convention and the forms of violence covered in the Convention, was to address stalking as a particular form of violence against women, which remains variously addressed in the member states' legislation. Some countries have provisions against stalking, some countries do not. Both for stalking and sexual harassment, we also looked into women's experiences of cyber stalking and cyber harassment, because these are particular forms of violence which have been recognized as emerging forms of violence and which do not respect the borders of EU member states. While the most questions in the survey concerned women's experiences after the age of 15, we also asked about experiences before the age of 15, so what happened in women's childhood. And finally, we also asked questions about women's fear of victimization, for example, whether women avoid certain areas in their either public areas or in areas in situations in private for fear of violence, either being sexually or physically assaulted. I will, in my presentation, give some particular focus on experiences of sexual violence, and I will also show you results particularly concerning Estonia. But I will first give you just a couple of results from the general results, which you may have already heard about. These survey results were published first in March this year in Brussels, and over the course of this year, we have presented these results in a number of occasions to make people more aware of them. So, some of the headline figures from the survey. 1 in 3 women in Europe have experienced physical or sexual violence since the age of 15. And about 1 in 10 women, 8%, have experienced this in a period of 12 months. 1 in 5 women, about 22%, have experienced some form of physical or sexual violence by a partner. This could be their current partner or their previous partner. 1 in 10 women, some 11%, have experienced some form of sexual violence, and specifically 5% of women have been raped. Looking at the results for the EU level and Estonia, we see that both in the EU in general and Estonia, some 1 in 5 women have experienced violence by the partner, and about 1 in 5 women have experienced violence by a previous partner since the age of 15. Looking specifically on sexual violence, because I showed you earlier the result that 11% of women in the EU have experienced some form of sexual violence. For sexual violence, but also for all other forms of violence, we didn't have in the survey only one question asking women about this, because good practice in this area shows that you get better results in surveys when you give respondents very concrete examples of what might have happened to them, asking them, did this take place or not? So for physical violence, we had some 9 questions. For sexual violence, we had 4 questions. Since my slides are in English, I will read these out. Since the age of 15, how often has someone forced you into sexual intercourse by holding you down or hurting you in some way? attempted to force you into sexual intercourse by holding you down or hurting you in some way, made you take part in any form of sexual activity when you did not want to or you were unable to refuse, or have you consented to sexual activity because you were afraid of what might happen if you refused? In the earlier slide, I showed the results saying that 5% of women in the EU said that they had been raped. This result is based on only the first question here, so the percentage of women who said that they had been forced into sexual intercourse. We know that in many EU member states, the legislation is broader than this. And what would be considered rape is not only being forced into sexual intercourse, but it's also sexual incidents where the victim did not consent. And therefore, we can conclude that in some countries, all 4 of these items here would be considered rape. So the prevalence of rape can indeed be higher than the 5%, and it can be closer to the 11%. Six percent of women in the EU said that they had experienced some form of sexual violence by a non-partner, that is, a relative, a colleague, a family member, or a stranger. 9% in Estonia. 7% of women said that they had experienced sexual violence by a partner, both in the EU and in Estonia. We didn't only ask women about what happened to them, but we also asked them about the consequences of the incident. Also, how many times it happened, whether women were injured in some way, what psychological consequences they had, whether the incident was reported anywhere, that is, whether women used any services available to them, and if not, why was that? What we see very clearly from the results, especially when we compare victims of physical violence and victims of sexual violence, is that the situation of victims of sexual violence is very different. And I think this reflects something that we in our agency see on many areas of fundamental rights, meaning the fact that people have equal rights doesn't mean that everybody has equal needs. And we see from the results that compared to victims of physical violence, victims of sexual violence suffer from many more different consequences. They suffer from these consequences in higher rates. So if we look at the different psychological consequences here, across the board, we see that victims of sexual violence were more likely to say that they suffered from these consequences. They also were more likely to say they suffered from a combination of these consequences. So 38% of victims of sexual violence by a partner said that they had 4 or more of these psychological consequences, compared with 17% of victims of physical violence. This means that the victims of sexual violence need particular attention. And this is something that can also be addressed in the context of the EU Victims Directive, which I will mention in a bit, in more detail. About 1 in 3 victims of partner violence in the EU said that following the most serious incident, they contacted some service or organization, 26% in Estonia. And 26% of victims of non-partner violence said that they had contacted services following the most serious incident, and 20% in Estonia. The rate of contacting these services is higher for the partner violence, and this is likely to be because we know from other research that often partner violence is not a single incident, but it can be a series of incidents. And here we were asking in the survey about the most serious incident. And it is very likely that women who contacted these organizations in the case of the most serious incident had also experienced other incidents which they may not have reported anywhere. Further to this, we know from the survey that about 1/3 of women talked about the incident with someone, either their friends or relatives, but 1/3 of women said in the survey that they had never talked about the incident with anyone before the survey interview. When asked which organizations or services did women contact as a consequence of the incident of sexual violence, we find that women were most likely to identify services in the health sector. This could be the hospital, doctor, healthcare center, or other healthcare professional. At the same time, again, we know from other research that the health service providers may not always be well informed of what services they could offer to these victims beyond the healthcare services. So healthcare service providers are, of course, very well trained and prepared to deal with the health consequences of violence, but they may not be always aware of, for example, victim support services that are available in their area in order for them to inform victims of violence about these services. So this is also one conclusion for us from the survey that concerns further training that was already also mentioned this morning by other speakers. Because it is, of course, for the healthcare service professionals their role to deal with the health concerns of victims, but they could and they shouldn't be expected to provide all services for them, but they should be informed about what other services are available so that they can help victims to get the help they need. When we asked in the survey whether women would agree for doctors routinely asking patients who come to their practice with certain injuries about whether these have been caused by violence, overwhelming majority, 87% of women said that they would agree for the doctor doing this. This further highlights the very, very important role of the healthcare sector in opening the discussion on violence against women and proactively asking women of what has happened. When we asked women who did contact some of these services about whether they were satisfied with the assistance they received, we see that there is still a challenge in meeting the needs of victims of sexual violence. And this can be particularly for the case for the police, as the victims who contacted the police as a result of sexual violence indicated a lower level of satisfaction with the assistance they received from the police. Again, this suggests to us a need for further sensitization and training for police rather than compared with other organizations. So, just to give you some conclusions on the results of on the physical and sexual violence, in the results report that we have put together on the results of the survey, where we cover all forms of violence, we include at the end of each section of the report detailed conclusions based on these results. At the top of our list is always the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, because this is the first legally binding instrument for Europe addressing comprehensively different forms of violence against women and the needs of victims. At the EU level, we also have the fairly recently passed directive on the rights of victims of crime. This directive recognizes the special needs of vulnerable victims, including victims of gender-based violence. And the member states need to implement this directive by the end of 2015. And at this point, it will be very important to see how the needs of vulnerable victims have been addressed in the implementation of this directive. When we look at the survey results by age, we see that young women display higher rates of victimization compared to older women. And this highlights the need for awareness-raising campaigns, particularly to address young women and the forms of violence they have experienced. And as was mentioned already earlier today, men also need to be positively involved in awareness-raising efforts, because the men, of course, are part of the problem, but they also therefore need to be part of the solution. The fact that many women are not seeking any form of assistance, are not even talking about the incidents with anyone, stresses the need to deal with intimate partner violence as a public matter rather than a private one. This concerns the way intimate partner violence is prosecuted, but also how it's dealt with, also in the media. In the survey we have looked at many risk factors of violence, and there are a number of them. And some of the differences that we find in the survey for rates of violence between different EU member states, they cannot be explained by one factor alone. There are very likely to be multiple factors which play a part across the EU. However, there has been a body of research for these risk factors, and for example, heavy alcohol use comes across as one of the risk factors. So we see in the survey that women who said that their partner often gets drunk experience also higher rates of violence than women whose partner does not use alcohol to that extent. I've also mentioned the conclusions about the role of healthcare professionals. But what is very important is also to ensure that the victim support services have adequate resources. We see in many member states that we talk about the importance of awareness raising, and there is certainly a role for victim support services also to raise awareness about their services and women's rights, because if women are not aware of their rights and the services available to them, they won't be able to access these rights. And but the fact is that in many cases, the victim support organizations do not have adequate resources to fulfill the awareness raising function. So their resources are limited to the extent that they have to focus on treating the clients that come to them, without also investing in awareness-raising efforts, which may then increase their number of clients and caseload. So this is a challenge for also EU member states to ensure the adequacy of these services and the resources they have. Focusing in my presentation on different forms of sexual violence, I will not cover all forms of violence that were included in the survey, but I will also now still summarize some results concerning sexual harassment. Again, as I showed in the case of sexual violence, we had a number of questions about women's experiences of sexual harassment, and so we in order to have comparable results at the EU level, we described in very clearly to the respondents what the types of incidents that they may have encountered, asking them whether they had been in this situation or not. So for sexual harassment, we asked, for example, about unwelcome touching, hugging, or kissing, receiving sexually suggestive comments or jokes that offended women, and receiving unwanted sexually explicit emails or SMS messages that offended them. And these are just 3 examples of a battery of questions that we ask about sexual harassment. The results from the survey show that 55% of women had experienced some form of sexual harassment since the age of 15, 53% in Estonia. About 1 in 5 women had experienced this in the 12 months alone, 21% in the EU 28, and 16% in Estonia. What was very important from the EU policy context was to recognize that in some 1/3 of women who had been victims of sexual harassment said that this happened in the employment context. So it could be by their boss or supervisor, by a co-worker, or by a client or patient. And given the EU's existing legal competence on sexual harassment at the workplace, it is now important to review whether existing measures are adequate. The survey further found that 3 in 4 women in the top management positions and highly qualified positions had experienced sexual harassment. What was also striking was that 20% of young women aged 18 to 29, had experienced cyber sexual harassment. And for these youngest women in the survey, the cyber sexual harassment accounted for more than half of their sexual harassment experiences. So this highlights the need to pay particular attention to the cyber sexual harassment, for which there might not be adequate tools at the EU level. The survey results suggest that the employer organizations and trade unions need to further promote awareness of sexual harassment and encourage reporting. There are EU guidelines by the social partners to address sexual harassment in the workplace, but these guidelines could be reviewed again and made more specific. There's a need to review the adequacy of existing policies for cyber harassment, and also for cyber stalking, as the online context may require special measures. We find that in many cases, for example, for harassment and stalking that uses the social networks, it is still very often the onus is often still on the women to withdraw from using these services. So if they are harassed online, women may feel they have no other option than to close down their social networking accounts and withdraw from using these services, rather than the abusers of these services being made to close their profiles or stop using them in this way. So the internet service providers and social media platforms could be more proactive also in this area by encouraging measures that enable women to report the abuse of these services. Finally, addressing very high levels of sexual harassment experienced by women in managerial positions and top management positions needs further attention. I will conclude by showing some results about the fear of crime. So the extent to which women said that they worry about victimization and the strategies they take to decrease their risk of victimization. This is important because some of the results might be due to the fact that women actively try to avoid situations where they fear they might be victimized. For example, women may avoid certain areas in their neighborhoods, or in other they might avoid certain public places if they feel that they are not safe there. And this may decrease the risk of women of experiencing violence, but it also it's a limitation to their rights, and it's a limitation to their daily lives, which can have a very constraining effect for them. About 1 in 5 women in the EU said that in the past 12 months they have been worried when in public or private places or situations about being victims of physical or sexual harassment. 27% of women in Estonia said that they've worried in the past 12 months about physical or sexual violence. 46% of women in the EU said that they avoid public situations or places because they are concerned for their safety in some situations. 40% of women in Estonia said this. One woman in 3 said that they avoid certain private situations and places for fear of victimization. This could be, for example, avoiding situations at the workplace, being alone with colleagues who you're concerned that can be abusive or harass you. Or it can include, for example, women not feeling comfortable going home because of the fear of what might happen there. 24% of women in Estonia said that they avoid some private situations or places for fear of victimization. Now, generally, I've already presented some conclusions, But what we see from the survey results is the further need to develop policy responses from different fields. So from employment, health, education, but not only in isolation, but also together. And there are good practices in some member states of for example, what's called MARACs, multi-agency risk assessment conferences, where service providers on a local level sit down together and share information about high-risk cases, because it might be that the police have some information that social services or child welfare services do not have, and vice versa. There may, in some instances, be limitations to the extent to which different authorities can share this type of information. And this have to be looked into if there are these kind of obstacles for working together. The forms of violence addressed in the survey raised the need to look critically about whether existing legislation is in place to ensure the protection of women. And in the context of the signature and ratification of the Istanbul Convention, there are initiatives already in motion in many EU member states to this effect. But for example, the results from the survey, which show the extent of stalking, one in 5 women experiencing stalking in their lifetime in the EU, highlight the need for further attention for specific forms of violence. Same for cyber forms of stalking and harassment. I've already mentioned the need for further training measures for professionals, both for concerning awareness, raising their awareness about different forms of sexual violence, raising awareness about the possible warning signs, such as forms of or symptoms of psychological violence, when psychological violence is often correlated with physical violence. But also to share information again with these different service providers on what other services are available, so that women who go to any one of these services can be informed about their rights and different options available for them. And I already mentioned in the context of cyber sexual harassment the need for the internet service providers and social media platforms to take a more proactive stance towards making sure that the abuses of these services can be adequately addressed. Now, I've been informed that in your conference packs you have the translation of our summary report into Estonian. This was something that we published just a couple of weeks ago, but that now means that our summary results are available from in 22 EU languages, together with the fact sheet that we provided already earlier. So if you're interested in other forms on the results on other forms of violence, or more detailed results and conclusions for the forms of violence that I've described today, I very much encourage you to look at the website of the FRA and the materials that we have provided there. What I specifically would like to stress is the online data explorer. You see this icon here in the bottom left-hand corner. We have that available now in German, English, and French. And that gives you access to very detailed results from the survey, also at the member state level. Because our main results report is more than 200 pages long, but if we want to present the results for all the different forms of violence from the survey, for all member states, the 200 pages were simply not enough. But the online tool provides you a possibility to browse the results and display them as maps, tables, graphs, and look at the results specifically for your member state, or compare your Estonia with with the EU average or the other member states. So that is what I had to present on the results, and I would be very happy to, during the whole course of today, to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sami. Meil on veel võimalus küsida Sami käest, kuigi Sami lubas väga lahkelt, et ta on siin terve päeva. Kui kellelgi tekkis mõni küsimus, praegu kohe. Ilmselt ei tekkinud. Minul on tegelikult endal üks. Sami, sa mainisid, et alkoholi kasutamine või alkoholi tarbimine, ränk joomine on üks riskitegur, mis naistevastast vägivalda sellele kaasa aitab. Meie mõlema riigid, nii Soome kui Eesti, on tuntud selle poolest, et siin juuakse päris palju, tarbitakse alkoholi ja ka naistevastane vägivald on mõlemas probleem. Kas see lahendus ongi nii lihtne, et vähendame joomist ja seetõttu või seeläbi ka väheneb naistevastane vägivald?
Well, I think in the survey it was very important for us to separate between alcohol consumption and the problematic alcohol consumption, because we know that in terms of the whole alcohol consumption in the EU, I think it's France where people consume the most alcohol, but it's not only how much you drink, but the way you drink, and that is, I think, the problem that has been the problem, for example, in Finland, where I'm from. That people drink a lot at once, and then that causes problems. But it's also the problem, I think, starts earlier on about already from the education and what is considered acceptable behavior and what is considered unacceptable behavior. There can be sometimes culture that when you're drunk, everything is acceptable, or it's it's fine to misbehave if you're drunk, or people are more understanding. And I think that's where the culture needs to change, and I think it needs to be more awareness for the fact that it's not okay to also to when you're drunk to do whatever you want. And I think in that sense, at least in Finland, I think there is some encouraging statistics also that younger people are drinking less than they used to, and they are getting drunk less often than they used to. So I think there is some hope that we are heading in a better direction, but we need to monitor the situation.
Faktid on teada, mida nendega peale hakata. Rosa Logan on Women Against the Violence Europe'i president ja tema räägib meile nüüd sellest, kuidas vägivallaga silmitsi seista, kogu teemaga silmitsi seista ja kuidas siis anda jõudu neile naistele, kes vägivalda on pidanud kogema.